You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
The roster purge is underway in Chicago, and I'm expecting that to take shape in free agency too when it comes to re-signing some of the Bears' own players that may end up playing somewhere else next year. This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm an analyst for Pro Football Focus, and I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today and hopefully every day. On the show today, we catch up on a flurry of changes coming to this Chicago Bears roster right on the dawn of free agency, kind of peek ahead to what we could be in store for then over the next couple of weeks here with the offseason really heating up across the entire NFL, but the Bears getting in on some of the action themselves with a couple of key releases and at least one, if not a couple more, potentially on their way, maybe more trade talks after the Khalil Mack deal. I mean, there's a lot going on, and it seems like Ryan Poles is really trying to put his stamp on this Bears roster. We'll get a sense of what exactly that could mean for this Bears team, because obviously the Khalil Mack trade was a big surprise, and we talked about that pretty extensively last week on the podcast, so we don't have to rehash that whole thing. If you want more Khalil Mack specifics, you can go back and listen to that podcast about what the defense is going to look like without him and what it kind of signals for the direction of this team. But very clearly, clearing out some of the Ryan Pace, Matt Nagy players, clearing out some extra salary cap room, more so for next year, but a little bit of relief this upcoming season as well, and kind of turning things over, changing out some of the players that, they just don't see as the right fit or just financially not what they want to pay for what they've been getting out of that positions, and getting some new blood in there. Because we have seen actually already a player out and a player back in at the same position. We'll start with running back Tariq Cohen. We did a podcast, was it 2 weeks ago now, within the last couple of weeks here, about how the writing was on the wall. And, no, not the only person that saw the writing on the wall with Tariq Cohen, but we sort of braced ourselves for that release coming. Obviously, some complications there with the ACL injury and released with an injury designation because he hasn't been able to pass a physical, which is probably why they released him, because he still isn't able to get back and be the full strength Tariq Cohen that they wanted him to. And his salary was going to be pushing $5 million this year. And that's not what they wanted to pay a backup running back who's not even available for the team. So yes, you would have liked to have Tariq Cohen on the roster. You would have liked to have a healthy Tariq Cohen on the roster. And I'm sure Luke Getsy, as an offensive coordinator, could have found a role for a healthy Tariq Cohen on the roster, but he's not healthy. And also financially, it's a lot to invest in the running back position for a guy who's not going to be your every down back. And when you already have David Montgomery and Khalil Herbert, both promising, obviously David Montgomery proven, Khalil Herbert promising young running backs at that spot. And they didn't wait long. In fact, I can't remember for sure what the order of events was here in terms of formally announcing the release of Tariq Cohen and then claiming a running back on waivers, Darrington Evans. Recent draft pick, I think 2020 of the Tennessee Titans out of Appalachian State, brought in on waivers. So that's why they were able to sign him before free agency started, because he had been waived by the Titans earlier this offseason, or I guess just recently here. And the Bears then claimed him. It's a separate process pre-free agency that doesn't come into any of the free agent equations, including the compensatory pick formula. They just pick up essentially the rest of his rookie contract, now come to Chicago. And it's like having that extra draft pick from 2020, a young athletic running back that they obviously seem to like. The reason why he was waived from Tennessee is because, ironically, with the Tariq Cohen stuff, because of injuries, right? Tennessee didn't want to keep, dealing with that. And apparently the Bears are willing to kind of see that through a little bit. Much more easy to stomach, I think, on that rookie contract compared to the $5 million that Tariq Cohen's going to get paid. So you can see where maybe it's a little bit more tolerable that way. There's still some money owed his way, but it's less than $1 million. It's a little surprising that his last team gave up on him so quickly because, he's a little bit on the smaller side. I think he's like 5'10", 200 pounds-ish or whatever, but a very fluid, shifty athlete at running back. Definitely a speed type player, the acceleration and the long speed, both short area and long distance straight line running. He's got some decent speed, right? He's not Tyreek Hill, John Ross. He's not Tariq Cohen fast, but he's very good fit in this sort of outside zone, one cut and go running scheme that the Bears are looking to implement here under offensive coordinator Luke Getsy. And Evans has some kickoff returning experience. I don't know if he did punts also at Appalachian State, but kickoff for sure too. It was an area that he was able to contribute. So he has potential special teams value as a number 3 running back, plus some of that speed that you may have lost with Tariq Cohen. Obviously, he's not going to be a physical, between the tackles type of runner. He's not necessarily like the tackle breaker either, right? Like he'll make guys miss, but like when contact is actually made, right? He's not going to necessarily bounce off of tackles, and he's not going to shake tackles off or force them off, right? He'll make the guy miss in open space, but when you actually do get to him, he maybe does go down a bit too easily, right? There's a reason why he was not a top pick at the running back spot, went later in that draft. And then, of course, now you have the injury concerns. Although I don't think he fumbled in college. I think that was one of the stats that came out with him. So he does actually have really good ball security. But now it's like, for the Bears, it's taking a flyer on a guy to fill a void by Tariq Cohen that you created, but much lower risk, lower stakes. You can release Evans later and not really have lost very much, and maybe you take a chance on a recent draft pick that you liked and would like to see if you can tap into some of that potential with some special teams upside to be that number 3 behind David Montgomery and Khalil Herbert. Why not? Take a shot, have fun with it, see if you can maybe find something there, and then you don't have to necessarily even go out and sign any other running backs at this point because you also have Ryan Nall on the roster, so you're more or less set at running back, which is why it was easy to move on from Tariq Cohen. It was one of the reasons we had talked about on that podcast. A little bit harder, I think, to move on from Eddie Goldman at nose tackle, but we'll look at what the future means for this defensive line, the other players on the roster, the other free agents, and what that could kind of mean for the Bears' plans next on Locked On Bears. Today's episode of Locked On Bears brought to you by the makers of the world's best tasting protein bar, Built Bars, and they really are incredible. They taste like candy bars, but they don't have all that extra sugar and junk that you don't need in a candy bar. For me, Built Bars really satisfy my sweet tooth because they're soft, they're easy to chew, they're covered in 100% real chocolate, and they come in a bunch of delicious flavors. I love the salted caramel, the raspberry, the chocolate mint brownie was so good. It's a limited flavor, but those are so good. Cookie dough brownie as well. I'm telling you, a ton of different flavors you'll absolutely love. But most flavors of Built Bar are only 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, 4 grams of carbs, and 17 grams of protein. So you get all the protein goodness, the macronutrients of a protein bar with that taste of a candy bar. There's nothing else on the market that can come anywhere close. You got to try it for yourself. Head on over to built.com, enter in our promo code LOCKED15, and you're going to get 15% off your next order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. The Chicago Bears have already taken a lot off of this 4-3 defensive line now with Khalil Mack traded to the Chargers, Akeem Hicks, a free agent testing free agency and likely then not going to be back. He even tweeted about like free agency, something about the family group chat. Free agency is wild in the family group chat. So like clearly not any kind of imminent return right away, at least to the Chicago Bears. And now the release of Eddie Goldman at nose tackle. Another one of these that like, we talked about it this offseason, right? It wasn't out of left field, wasn't a complete surprise. He was one of the sort of like salary cap casualty types, but it kind of came with the sort of not the caveat, but the idea that like, hey, it's gonna leave a pretty big hole if you're losing Akeem Hicks and Eddie Goldman this offseason. Those could be your 2 inside defensive tackle starters in this 4-down defensive line. All of a sudden, that is a lot to replace. And of course, Goldman has been a career Chicago Bear now, but this would have been his 7th season, I think, had he stuck around. But a 2nd-round pick by Ryan Pace in 2015, a solid nose tackle from Florida State, right? I mean, it kind of came in as advertised, always felt a little bit underrated in terms of how the world of nose tackles are treated. Never big sack or stat numbers in general, right? Nose tackles don't get a lot of great sacks, but like he was in the middle of that 3-4 defense. So often the reason why linebackers had a free, not always free runs to the running back, but like easier time stopping the run, and how much we would notice some of that vacancy when Eddie Goldman opted out for the 2020 season, and then had been injured in 2021, right? And we had had a lot of snaps in recent seasons without Eddie Goldman, and there was an unnoticeable absence at times. Although there were also times when he was on the field and either secretly not as healthy as we thought he might be, or something was going on, and the level of play wasn't where it was earlier in his career, right? There had been a drop off from Eddie Goldman, whether that's injury or whether that's something else. I mean, we don't know exactly, but you could kind of see it on the field. And that's why it was a little bit easier to maybe move on at this stage and save the $6 million or whatever they're going to get here from Goldman being gone. But now you're left with that interior defensive tackle position right now. I mean, is your nose tackle instantly then Angelo Blackson or maybe Kyrus Tonga, the rookie 7th round pick? Seems a little bit early to pencil him in specifically as the starting nose tackle. I'm not exactly sure how they see Angelo Blackson's fit here either. I'd be curious. We'll get into some potential salary cap, other potential cuts or trades that could be coming. Although, Blackson being a signing of the previous regime from a 3-4 defense, they could cut him and save $2 million. They owe him 3 this year. They could cut him and save 2 and just have $1 million dead. Wouldn't surprise me if he was on that list. But again, you're all going to need bodies at that interior defensive tackle positions. It's going to have to be a fairly significant priority for them through free agency and the draft. And we've kind of talked before on this podcast already about how the free agent pool at defensive tackle, at least not at the 3 technique pass rushing tackle spot, is very, very light. There's plenty of nose tackles out there. And that's what makes the Eddie Goldman release, I think, a little bit easier, is that you can shed his salary and find a replacement that won't be as good, at least not as good as peak Eddie Goldman, but will still be pretty good. Will get the job done in terms of run defense and not being much of a pass rusher for maybe, we don't know what the market's going to look like, but maybe half the price, 2/3 of the price, right? And you can take that money that you saved in the future, especially, and put some of it now toward a replacement nose tackle, maybe come out a little bit ahead in there too, and get a guy that might just be a better fit for your system, your scheme, and the mentality that you want from your defense, however that might look. I'm curious what it means for Bilal Nichols. When you have Goldman and potentially Hicks gone, does that add all the more reason you want to go re-sign Bilal Nichols and make sure you've got somebody coming back there? I mean, as of the time of recording this podcast, they haven't made that move yet. And that'll be the curious thing as we go through free agency. We're going to be reacting, every day with the podcast, but things move very quickly, and it's possible little things like that could be outdated by the time you hear the podcast, depending on when the Bears make the moves relative to when we record the podcast. But regardless, for now, no Bilal Nichols. And I could he's the one I'm so torn on either way. Like, do I think the Bears will or will not re-sign him? It's so hard to tell, right? You could think, well, they don't see Goldman as a fit, so he's gone. They don't seem to want Akeem Hicks, so he's gone. So, could you then say, well, they also don't see Bilal Nichols, right? Could they all sort of fit in the same mold of Nichols isn't quite athletic enough and explosive enough to be the 3 technique that they want, but he's maybe not also quite big and strong and stout enough to be the nose tackle that they want. It's why he was more the 3-4 defensive end. I mean, they played him at nose tackle in place of Eddie Goldman. He was okay. I mean, he was fine, but do you want to pay that $8-9 million a year on a long-term deal? I mean, maybe he's young, right? He's young and malleable and has not reached his peak yet as his prime as an NFL defensive lineman. There's room for him to keep getting better. And that would be, I think, the main reason why the Chicago Bears would go out and bring him back. But I could also see them saying, you know what? We just want to get rid of some of these Ryan Pace guys, not because Ryan Pace took them, but just because for whatever reason, they don't like the way they're going to translate to this new defense, whether they don't like what they saw on tape in terms of the mentality that they want under Matt Eberflus, whatever the reason might be. You could see them saying, you know what? We're shedding some of these past regime guys, and we want to get our own guys in there. And you could see Nichols maybe being a product of that. I more likely would think James Daniels will be a product of that, and certainly Allen Robinson, I think, is going to be a product of that. In that order, I think least likely to come back is Allen Robinson, then slightly more likely is James Daniels, and then more likely than that is Bilal Nichols. That's sort of if I had to rank the least likely in order, it's Robinson, then Daniels, then Nichols in terms of guys not coming back. But we'll see. It's hard to get a sense of they just want a blanket reset of getting or is Nichols and maybe Daniels good enough and fit well enough from the previous regime to say, no, bring them back, pay them the long-term deal, and have them be part of the long-term future of this Bears defense? That was the thing. They didn't want Mack to be part of the long-term future of this Bears defense. Goldman not going to be part of the long-term future. Hicks, too old to be part of the long-term future. Nichols and Daniels are young enough, and so is Robinson, but we just kind of seems like that ship has probably sailed a little bit. But we'll see. It's definitely more about the long-term plans for both sides of the ball, and why I think we could still see at least one or two more moves coming in terms of clearing some things out and where we might see this offense and defense really go from here. We'll take a look at what should happen now as the free agent tampering period is about to begin next on Locked On Bears. Still time to have fun with some free agency prop bets with our friends at BetOnline. It's the best spot for all of your sports scores, podcasts, and news throughout the offseason. All the latest odds, contests, and player props. BetOnline.net is the number one source for all your sports betting needs and info. Plus, not only NFL free agency and the draft coming up, but now college basketball tournament time. BetOnline is the place to be, man. They have all of your lines and spreads covered for each and every round. Got to check it out today. Head over to their website or use your mobile device to learn all about the trends and action you need to know, not just basketball, but soccer, hockey, tennis. Hey, we have a baseball season coming all of a sudden. You can get your baseball odds at BetOnline now. Finally, back in the mix, and so much more, including your favorite Vegas casino games online, all through our friends at betonline.net, where the game starts. I think the next moves for the Chicago Bears this offseason are going to start with, one move that's been reportedly expected to happen that as of the time of this recording has not happened. We've seen, I believe it was Brad Biggs of the Chicago Tribune reported that the Bears are expected to release linebacker Danny Trevathan. The timing on that is going to be interesting because they're likely going to designate him a post-June 1st cut, which just allows them to spread the dead salary cap money to this year and next year. But you just don't get that savings until June 1st, but you can release the player immediately, let them become a free agent right away and sign with other teams. And then after June 1st is when the salary cap math comes through, like on your bank account, like a pending payment in the salary cap. So you get the extra space after June 1st. But, they could also just end up waiting on this the way they did sort of with Charles Leno a bit last season. And I think there were a couple other holdovers, like they waited until like after the draft to finally make a release that we were sort of expecting was going to come. So I'm just interested on the timeline there in terms of a potential Danny Trevathan release. But then the Bears are really going to have some work to do at linebacker. When you look at having, three off-ball linebackers in the base defense with Roquan Smith, I mean, your other linebackers under contract right now then are going to be Caleb Johnson and I think Joe Thomas, who they just signed more recently. I don't remember who Joe Thomas played with most recently, but Joe Thomas was a linebacker they signed, again, off of the free agent pool, so it's not part of regular free agent. He was already released early and was a free agent this offseason. He was a linebacker, if you remember, back in, 2014, 2017, I don't remember what year it was. Kadeem Carey got a big hit by a Packers linebacker, and you remember the C popped off of the side of his helmet when he got hit? Joe Thomas was the linebacker that hit Kadeem Carey and knocked the C off of his helmet. That's what kind of brings him full circle back to the Chicago Bears. So as of now, I mean, he's going to pencil in as a linebacker starter. I mean, until they bring you somebody else there. Because I mean, the other move that I'm sort of waiting to see if they're going to do or what they think the future is going to be is with Jeremiah Atochu, who they signed last season, the outside linebacker from the Denver Broncos, who spent most of the season on injured reserve. I can't remember exactly what his injury was or when exactly he went down, but I totally kind of forgot about him as a member of this roster because he just wasn't part of the equation, right? It was Mack and Quinn and then Travis Gibson, right? And then they signed Bruce Irvin in there, and that was part of the rotation there. But Atauchu was not really part of the defensive plans. But he seems like he's way too light to play the 4-3 defensive end spot. I mean, he's like a 6'3", 250-pound outside linebacker or whatever, and he's just not. I don't think it would seem like he wouldn't be a great fit in the edge rusher role in this scheme, at least in a base defense. He could play sort of a nickel pass rusher, and then they could keep him to be purely a nickel pass rusher and or move him to never been a major factor in coverage, but pass rushing and run defense. Anthony Barr does it. Right? He's not that it's going to be the exact same role in this defense, but like it seems like a weird fit there, and I'm surprised that move hasn't happened yet. A similar contract to Blackson where he's due $3.1 million. If they cut him, they'd save $2 million. If they keep him, they'd pay him $3 million. So they could save $2 million and still pay $1 million in dead. It's not like massive cap savings. It's just more like, does he fit what they want to do on defense? That's why I'm wondering if they have a plan for him or if he's just going to be the next one to go. They just, for whatever reason, haven't got around to like announcing the actual move there. But clearly, very big holes at off-ball linebacker. It's Roquan, and you need probably 2 more starters there. Maybe Joe Thomas can be a starter, but you'd like to have some kind of competition there. You're going to need another starting safety with Tashawn Gibson as a free agent. You're going to need a starting cornerback and a slot cornerback. You're going to need a 3-technique defensive tackle and a nose tackle, although you could re-sign Bilal Nichols and put him in one. And then on the offense, you're going to need at least 2 wide receivers, at least 2 offensive linemen, and maybe a tight end in there. Or there's a lot of work to do, and there's a lot of salary cap space. It goes quickly when you're talking about those cap hits in year one. So that's why it feels like the Bears aren't necessarily going to make a big splash free agent signing on the opening bell of free agency. And watch, right as I say that, they're going to go out and sign Juju Smith-Schuster or Christian Kirk to some big contract, right? Just to prove me wrong. But it feels like because they're so long-term focused right now that, you make that big day one free agent splash signing when you're really trying to get better right now, right? I think there's that stat that's gone around that like the team that spends the most in the beginning of free agency typically adds like 3 wins to their win total, including the Bears did in 2018. And like, that's great, but like, that's not what the Bears are necessarily trying to do. So I think any player they sign to a long-term deal is going to be more about the long-term there and not so much about the immediate term. And that's why it doesn't seem like, why are they going to go out and spend huge money at a premier position right now? I mean, yes, you like to get good wide receivers around Justin Fields. Absolutely. And if that's spending big money on a free agent, sure. Same with the offensive line, right? You want to have a good offensive line in front of Justin Fields. And I would advocate for signing a top one. Yes, it would be very good and valuable. It just doesn't seem like that's exactly what would align with their other actions right now, right? It's much more long term. That doesn't mean they're not going to sign anybody good, right? Of course, they want to sign. They have to sign plenty of players and get starting quality players in there. It just doesn't seem like the top of the market is necessarily exactly where they want to be. But I wouldn't put anything past Ryan Poles at this point. He's certainly taken us in a different direction very quickly in a way that we weren't immediately expecting to all sort of come together with the Mac trade and all the releases right on the dawn of free agency here. So you never know the way he aggressively rebuilt the Chiefs offensive line last season. But again, that was like an aggressive win now type of move, sign 2 big free agents, trade for a player, use draft picks, rebuild that because the Chiefs championship window is now, right? So that's a different strategy, a different place in the team building process than what Poles is now. This feels more like we're going to eat some dead money now. We're going to take our lumps a little bit in 2022. We're going to add some draft picks. We're going to get younger. We're going to build our system and our infrastructure out a little bit more, develop some guys, and then really be ready to go next offseason. And so a big free agent signing right now doesn't seem like exactly what we would expect. I mean, and the same kind of thing with like other player releases and trades, right? They've kind of sifted through most of what they're going to do. People have floated out Robert Quinn being traded potentially, or Eddie Jackson potentially as guys just that would maybe make sense. Both of those contracts are very easy to get out of after this season. And so if you trade them, yes, you're getting some compensation and there's value in that for sure. But if you don't trade them and after a year from now, you kind of decide, you know what, just not going to be a part of our plans, you can cut them, save the money then, and at least sort of give yourself the flexibility at that time and get the savings next year versus trading them now to get the savings next year or having them on the roster and getting the savings next year. It's different than Mac with Mac, where you were kind of locked into his contract for another like 3 or 4 seasons of hard to get out of big money. And Jackson and Quinn are a little bit more flexible financially after this season. So I would expect them to hang on unless the Bears can really get the draft pick compensation that they're looking for. But if they only got a 2nd round pick and a 6th for Khalil Mack, that doesn't seem like necessarily Robert Quinn and Eddie Jackson, maybe Quinn coming off of such a big season, but not going to command, top trade compensation. I think the deal with free agency literally like here now, I think a deal may have been done already if it was going to be done, at least until we get closer to draft day and teams kind of see what they have left after these first few waves of free agency. You can be sure whatever the Bears do to start out free agency We'll break it all down for you on tomorrow's podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button so you can keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today, hopefully every day. If you're looking for your second listen, got some new hosts over at Locked On Bulls, keeping things rolling there as they get ready for, get closer to the playoffs. And what's a fun Bulls team with Alex Caruso back. You can check them out. Plus, baseball's back. Locked On MLB, Locked On Cubs, Locked On White Sox. We also have Locked On Blackhawks, Locked On Iowa Hawkeyes for all of you with college basketball tournament right around the corner. Plenty of college podcasts across the nation. We've got something for you here for your second listen right after you get your daily Bears fill with Locked On Bears, because Locked On Podcast Network is your team every day. And I hope that the Locked On Bears podcast makes it that much easier for you to bear down.